Welcome to our deep dive into the Nordic countries. You know, we always hear about how peaceful and prosperous they are. But as they head into 2025, well, let's just say there are some serious cracks in that perfect image.
Very true.
We're talking major political shifts, some real economic surprises, and even a potential energy crisis brewing. It's a lot to unpack.
It is. And it really challenges our assumptions about this region.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So to guide us today, we've got a fantastic comparative analysis from Political Shift. They pulled data from the World Bank, added insights from the Financial Times, and even Focus Economics. Get ready to see Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Finland, and Iceland in a whole new light.
What's fascinating to me is that these nations that are so often grouped together as, this model of stability are actually on very different paths. Each one is grappling with unique challenges and opportunities as we head into the new year.
Okay, let's jump right in. Let's start with the economic landscape because I was blown away by this.
Yep.
Iceland had a booming 7.2% GDP growth in 2022.
Wow.
That's almost double Denmark's growth, and Denmark was already doing pretty well. That's impressive.
But what really struck me is that this tiny nation is pulling this off with a focus on tourism and renewable energy. It's like they're writing their own playbook.
It really shows how smaller economies can leverage their strengths, in a globalized world. But it does raise an interesting question. Can this growth be sustained, or is it a temporary blip?
That's something I want you all to think about as we go along. Now, Iceland might be the growth champion, but when it comes to overall wealth, Norway is in a league of its own. Their GDP per capita, basically the average wealth per person, is a staggering $106,148.08. Denmark trails behind at $66,983.01, followed by Sweden and Finland. What does this tell us about the economic diversity within the Nordic model?
Well, I think it challenges this assumption that these nations are economically homogenous. Norway's wealth, of course, is largely fueled by its oil and gas reserves, which, as you mentioned, comes with its own set of issues.
Yeah.
But it's important to note that Norway also invests heavily in its sovereign wealth fund, ensuring long-term financial stability.
So even with all that oil money, they're thinking about the future. Exactly.
Planning ahead.
Smart move. But let's not forget about the people. Unemployment rates paint an interesting picture here. Norway wins again with a remarkably low 3.2% unemployment. Meanwhile, Sweden is struggling at 7.4%. That's a huge difference. I know Norway's oil wealth creates jobs, but is that the only reason for this gap?
It's not the whole story.
Yeah.
Sweden's economy has historically been very reliant on manufacturing, and it's been hit harder by globalization and automation. And their social safety nets, while generous, may have disincentivized some from actively seeking employment. It's complicated.
It really shows how different approaches to social welfare can impact the job market. But even in Norway, things aren't all rosy. Those oil and gas reserves are causing some unexpected problems. Soaring electricity prices are pushing them towards an energy crisis of all things.
It is paradoxical, isn't it?
Who could have predicted that? Norway, a major energy exporter, facing an energy crunch at home. It highlights the disconnect between resource abundance and affordability, especially, with these volatile global energy markets. Their solution: potentially cutting energy links with Europe, specifically Denmark, the UK, and Germany.
Oh, okay.
It's a drastic move, but they argue it's necessary to prioritize their own citizens.
Talk about a tough decision. It makes you wonder, would you support such a move if it meant potentially lower energy bills but less cooperation with your neighbors? It's a real ethical dilemma. But before we dive into the politics of it all, let's not forget Sweden's battle with inflation, a painful 8.4% in 2022, the highest in the group. What's driving that?
Well, several factors are at play here. Global energy prices and supply chain disruptions are definitely playing a role, but so are domestic policies. For example, Sweden's transition to a greener economy, while admirable, has led to increased costs in some sectors.
It's kind of a perfect storm.
In a way,
Yeah.
yes. And this inflation is putting a real strain on households and is likely a factor in their recent political shifts.
Speaking of which, let's move on to the political landscape, because this is where things get really interesting. Sweden has taken a sharp turn to the right with a new coalition government. The Sweden Democrats, a right-wing populist party, previously on the fringes of Swedish politics, are now part of the ruling coalition. They've joined forces with the moderates, a more traditional center-right party.
It is a significant shift. The Sweden Democrats have campaigned on stricter immigration policies and a tougher stance on law and order. Their rise to power reflects a growing anxiety among some segments of the population about the impact of immigration on Swedish society and culture.
So while Denmark is enjoying stability and projected growth, Sweden's grappling with political upheaval and rising anxieties. Quite a contrast, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. It highlights the diversity of political trends within the Nordic region. Denmark's pragmatic approach to policymaking, coupled with a relatively homogeneous population, has contributed to their stability. But Sweden's experience shows how economic anxieties and cultural shifts can lead to dramatic political realignments.
And then there's Norway sitting on their oil wealth, facing an energy crisis, and potentially cutting off their neighbors. What's the outlook for 2025 and beyond in this region?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's clear that the Nordic model, while admired, is under pressure.
Pressure from economic uncertainty, political shifts, and those global trends we keep hearing about.
Exactly. But it's also a region known for its resilience and innovation. It'll be fascinating to see how they navigate these challenges and what lessons they offer the rest of the world.
That's a great point. It's not just about the Nordics. It's about understanding how these global forces are impacting every corner of the world. So listener, as we continue our deep dive, think about the parallels to your own country, your own community. How are these same forces shaping your world? We'll be back in a moment to explore the social and cultural implications of all this.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the Nordic nations. We've talked about their economic and political landscapes, but now it's time to explore the human side of the story. How are these shifts affecting people's lives, their cultures, their very sense of identity?
It's like we're looking beneath the surface, right? We've seen the impressive GDP numbers and the political shakeups, but now we want to understand how those translate into everyday realities for people in these countries.
Exactly. For instance, we discussed Sweden's stricter immigration policies, but what does that actually mean for immigrants who are already there trying to build a life? Or for those seeking refuge in Sweden hoping for a safe haven?
Yeah, that's a question we can't ignore. It gets to the heart of how these societies balance their values of openness and inclusivity with concerns about national identity and security. It's a complex issue, and it's playing out all over the world.
Absolutely. And it's not just about immigration. The Nordic model, with its famous social safety nets, is facing challenges from globalization, technological advancements, and aging populations. It makes you wonder, can these countries maintain their commitment to social welfare while adapting to these new economic realities?
That's the million-kroner question, isn't it? It's fascinating to see how these forces are putting pressure on a model that's been held up as an example for so long.
Right. Let's take a closer look at immigration, a topic that's become increasingly contentious across the Nordic region. As we mentioned, Sweden's new government has taken a much tougher stance, tightening asylum rules and emphasizing assimilation into Swedish culture.
So what's driving this shift? Is it purely based on economics? Or are there deeper cultural anxieties at play? And we've seen this kind of rhetoric pop up in other parts of the world, too.
It's definitely a mix of factors. Concerns about the economic costs of immigration, especially for social welfare systems, have been a major talking point. But there are also these underlying anxieties about how immigration is changing the face of these historically homogenous societies.
It's like that age-old question, can a society absorb large numbers of newcomers while still holding on to its unique cultural identity? It's a question every country grapples with, and there are no easy answers.
Precisely. The Nordic countries have always prided themselves on their openness and tolerance, but they're now navigating the challenges of integrating diverse populations while addressing concerns about national cohesion.
It's a delicate balancing act for sure. So how are immigrant communities responding to these policy changes and shifts in social attitudes? Are they feeling welcome, or are they facing pushback?
It's a mixed bag, really. Some immigrant groups have integrated well and feel a strong sense of belonging in their new home. They've learned the language, found jobs, and built communities. But others face discrimination, social isolation, and barriers to opportunity. There's a growing sense of uncertainty, particularly among Muslim communities, who often feel targeted by anti-immigration rhetoric.
It's a reminder that even in societies known for their progressive values, integration is an ongoing process, and there's always a risk of marginalization and exclusion. It's a human story that goes beyond the headlines.
Absolutely. And it's not just immigrants who are feeling the pressure. The Nordic model itself, with its cradle-to-grave social safety nets, is facing some serious sustainability challenges.
You're talking about those generous welfare programs that provide healthcare, education, and social security, the very things that have made these countries famous. What's putting them at risk?
Well, a number of factors are converging. Globalization and technological change have eroded the traditional manufacturing base of many Nordic economies, leading to job losses and wage stagnation.
So fewer people are paying into the system, but more people are relying on it. I can see how that would create a strain.
Exactly. And on top of that, they have aging populations. This means more people are drawing pensions and healthcare benefits, while fewer young people are entering the workforce to support those systems.
It's a classic case of too many dependents and not enough contributors. How are these countries trying to address this fiscal imbalance? I imagine there's some tough choices ahead.
They are. They're exploring a range of options, raising taxes, trimming benefits, encouraging people to work longer, and even promoting immigration to boost the workforce.
But each of those options comes with its own set of trade-offs and political challenges. It's like they're trying to solve a puzzle with no easy solution.
Precisely. And it raises fundamental questions about the future of the Nordic model. Can they maintain their high levels of social spending and equality in the face of these economic and demographic pressures?
That's a question that's being debated fiercely across the region. Some people argue that the Nordic model needs to be reformed, maybe by introducing more market-based mechanisms and scaling back the role of the state. Others say that the core principles of the model, solidarity, equality, and social justice, are more important than ever in a world that's becoming increasingly unequal.
It's a clash of ideologies, really. A battle of ideas about the role of government, the balance between individual responsibility and social solidarity, and ultimately what defines a just society. These are conversations happening not just in the halls of government, but in everyday life, in cafes and homes on the streets.
It's a reminder that these issues aren't just abstract policy debates. They have a real impact on people's lives, their hopes, their fears, their sense of belonging.
Exactly. And as these societies grapple with these complex transitions, their choices will have ripple effects far beyond their own borders. The world is watching, eager to see how the Nordic model adapts and evolves in the face of these global challenges.
It's amazing to see how these countries that are often held up as, a model of social progress are facing such familiar challenges. It's like a microcosm of the global struggles happening everywhere.
Precisely. We have this tendency to romanticize the Nordic model, but the reality is much more complex and nuanced. These societies are not utopias. They're dynamic and evolving entities grappling with the same tensions and contradictions that exist in every society.
Yeah, you're right. There's no magic formula for creating a perfect society.
Yeah.
Each country is finding its own way, balancing its unique history, cultural values, and economic situation.
Exactly. Take Sweden, for example. Their recent political shift to the right shows a growing unease about immigration and its impact on their national identity. But it also reveals a deeper dissatisfaction with the traditional political establishment and a desire for change.
And then there's Norway, wrestling with the irony of being an energy superpower, but facing high energy prices at home. It highlights those complex trade-offs between national interests, regional cooperation, and the global energy market.
It also underlines the challenges of transitioning to a more sustainable energy future while ensuring that everyone has access to affordable and reliable energy. It's a tightrope walk for sure.
And let's not forget Finland, quietly recovering from an economic recession and showing that even in a globalized world, smaller economies can bounce back and find their own path.
Their experience offers a glimmer of hope that resilience and adaptability are possible even when facing economic headwinds. It's inspiring, really.
So as we wrap up our Nordic deep dive, what are the big takeaways here? What can we learn from these countries as they navigate these turbulent waters?
Well, first and foremost, it's a reminder that even the most successful societies aren't immune to change and disruption. The Nordic model, long admired for its social cohesion and economic equality, is facing real challenges just like everywhere else.
Yeah. But it's also a testament to the power of innovation adaptation and a willingness to experiment. These countries aren't stuck in the past. They're actively searching for new solutions to address the challenges of the 21st century.
And perhaps most importantly, it's a reminder that there's no single blueprint for success. Each society has to find its own path, balancing its own unique values and priorities. What works in one context might not work in another.
So it's all about learning from each other, sharing best practices, and being open to new ideas.
Exactly. And I think that's where the real value of this deep dive lies. It's not about giving definitive answers, but about sparking curiosity, challenging assumptions, and encouraging a more nuanced understanding of these complex issues.
Absolutely.
Well,
Ultimately, whether we're talking about the Nordic countries or any other part of the world, these challenges are interconnected. We're all in this together, dealing with the forces of globalization, technological change, and the search for a more just and sustainable future.
indeed. And as we continue to explore these issues in future deep dives, let's keep in mind the lessons we've learned from the Nordic experience, the importance of adaptability, the power of innovation, and the necessity of open and honest conversations about the choices we face.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this Nordic adventure. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those deep dive spirits high.